So in this video, we're talking crop factor. Now, when I say crop factor, we're not talking about full frame versus crop sensor per se, because that's an entirely separate conversation and we're not going to dive into that. But in this video, I strictly want to talk about the crop factor and how it applies to us photographers and videographers. Now, I definitely feel like this is something that is confusing for newer photographers, those just getting into the space. But I also think that more experienced photographers tend to sometimes not quite understand it or explain it correctly or fully grasp the concept of what it is and when it applies. And so I just want to dive into that into this video. Now, fundamentally, let's talk about what the crop factor is and why it exists. The crop factor is not this inherent thing that is a thing because we're dealing with a crop sensor or a crop sensor specific lens. The crop factor exists solely because in our industry, we base everything off of a full frame sensor. Now, a full frame sensor is what was designed to most closely match and resemble a 35mm piece of film, because in the film days, that also was just what was considered the standard. There obviously were other size films, but the 35mm was what was considered standard. So the full frame in the digital space was created to also be that standard in our industry. And so the crop factor solely exists because of that standard. Anything that isn't full frame is then compared or related to the full frame sensor. And so the crop factor in and of itself is just merely a value that helps equate a crop sensor to a full frame. Now, most crop sensors, or you may hear aps-c, same thing, aps-c, crop sensor, interchangeable. Most crop sensor cameras have a 1.5 times crop factor. Canon is a 1.6. I want to say there may be some that's a 1.8, but I could be making that up. So you have that factor. You have, micro four thirds, which is an even smaller sensor than a crop sensor. Those are roughly 2 times. You have a medium format, which is actually a bigger sensor than a full frame, and that also has a crop factor of 0.79. So everything relates back to a full frame sensor, and that is why the crop factor exists. I really want to drive the point home that the crop factor is not this thing that is inherent because you have a crop sensor. It merely is just because everything gets related back to that standard. Now, in saying that, I think it's very important to understand that in a lot of cases, the crop factor is somewhat irrelevant, right? Because it is just relating back to something else, it is sometimes irrelevant, but it is good to understand it so that you know how to apply it in the cases that you need to apply it. Now, something that you hear all the time is that if you have a crop sensor camera and you put a lens, a full frame lens, people often say full frame lens, but this actually applies to crop sensor lenses as well. And I'll touch on that in a minute. But you hear something about applying that crop factor to the focal length of that lens. Now, if you go out on the internet, you go into the forums, or often if you are in a group and you're talking to people, you'll often hear, okay, well, if you put this lens on your crop sensor and you multiply it, it's going to become this focal length of a lens. So, if you put this 40mm lens on your crop sensor camera, it's going to become a 60mm lens. And you will undoubtedly get people that will respond and say, no, it doesn't change. The focal length is the focal length. If you put a 40mm lens on a full frame or a 40mm lens on a crop sensor, it's still a 40mm lens. And that is absolutely true. So to nerd out just for a second, just to help you understand the focal length. The focal length of a lens is based off of something called a nodal point. And the nodal point is, it is a lot more scientific than what I'm going to make it out right now. But effectively, the nodal point is where the light rays coming through the front of your lens intersect to form a point. Okay, so the light comes in, it's funneled into a point, and then it goes back out that way, and then it hits the sensor. The focal length of a lens is the distance in millimeters from the nodal point, the point where the light rays form a point, from the nodal point to the sensor. That distance is your focal length. So that is why you can have something like a plastic fantastic, which is very small, and then you can have a Sigma art lens, an f1.4 that is 2 or 3 times bigger than the plastic fantastic, but they're both 50 mil lens. That is the reason why, because the focal length of a lens is based solely off of the distance from point A to point B, and that does not change based off of the design of the lens and the focal length and the nodal point and all of those things. So when people say, you know, if you put a 40 mil on a full frame, it's still a 40 mil on a crop sensor, that's absolutely true. The crop factor, when it's applied, what it is actually referring to is a angle of view or a field of view. Those two things mean the same thing. They can be used interchangeably. I more likely will say field of view than I would angle of view, but it is the same thing. Angle of view, field of view. And effectively, all that means is, what can the lens see? What can you see when you put that lens on there? What is the field of view? What is in frame? What can that sensor capture? And so applying that crop factor to your lens when you put it on a crop sensor camera is essentially just giving you the effective focal length of the field of view of what you would have on a full frame camera. So if we stick with that 40 mil example, if you put a 40 mil lens on a full frame, you have a 40 mil field of view because full frame is the standard. If you put that same 40 mil lens onto a crop sensor camera, you have an effective field of view of a 60 millimeter lens. So what that means is that that 40 mil lens on a crop sensor camera is going to give you the equivalent field of view as a 60 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. That is essentially all that the crop factor is. When people talk about effective focal length, or even when they say it becomes this focal length, they're simply referring to the field of view. Now, when I talk about why it's not a thing, and it is only a thing because we're comparing it to something else. At the end of the day, when you put that 40 mil on your crop sensor, what you see is what you see. And if we didn't have anything else to compare it to, we wouldn't have a crop factor. You wouldn't have to do a conversion simply because you have a crop sensor camera or you're putting a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera. You wouldn't have to do this conversion if we didn't have something that we were comparing it to. So in a way, it is a bit arbitrary, but it is helpful in the sense of, you know, if you have shot with a full frame lens, so you understand the field of view that you get with that lens on a full frame, it is helpful to know that your field of view is going to obviously be narrow and more punched in on that crop sensor. So if you were shooting with a 24 on a full frame and you only had a limited amount of space to back up, you know that in putting that same 24 mil lens on your crop sensor, it's going to turn it into roughly a 40. It's like a 38.5, something like that, 38.6. It's going to give you roughly a 40 mil field of view. That may not be wide enough for you. And if you don't have the ability to back up, then you're going to be too tight. So now, you know, instead of using a 24 mil, you might need a 20 mil or a 16 mil. So that's where it becomes useful. But at the end of the day, it is just one thing being compared to something else. Okay. Now, something that I don't think is talked about as much, and you don't hear about it as much, is that not only do you have to multiply your focal length by the crop factor, but you also need to multiply your aperture by the crop factor. Now, in me saying that is true sometimes. Okay, sometimes. Now, whereas the focal length is typically something that you're going to do every time because it has to do with what you see, the aperture being applied to that crop factor is dependent on a couple of factors. And there will probably be someone that wants to argue with me on this, and that's fine. Go down in the comments and tell me what you think. But there's a couple of factors that you have to take into account. Now, before we go into those factors, let's first understand why you would even need to do that in the first place. And it ultimately comes down to distance, okay? But not only distance, it comes down to how you're framing your subject. Now, the reason why this is a thing is because if you have let's go back to the 40 mil example. We're going to stick with that to keep it consistent throughout this video. If you have that 40 mil lens on your full frame, and let's say you're framing full body, you have a subject and you're filling the frame with that subject from head to toe. If you put that same 40 mil lens on your crop sensor camera, you now have an effective field of view of 60. So if you stand in the same exact spot, you're not going to be able to frame your subject from head to toe because you're more punched in. You have a 60 mil field of view versus that 40. So you've lost some of that headroom and that foot room. So in order to frame it the same exact way, you have to back up to now be able to frame that subject full body. In backing up, you are increasing the distance between you and your subject. And increasing the distance between you and your subject, you are now also increasing the depth of field. What that means is you're going to have a wider area within your depth of field range than you do on that full frame. And so to account for that, you would multiply your aperture by that crop factor, and then that's going to give you the equivalent depth of field, out of focus area bokeh that you would get on a crop sensor or on a full frame. So let's say you were shooting 40 mil at f4 on your full frame. If you switch that over to your aps-c, now you have the equivalent of an f6 or of an f6. You have the equivalent of a 60 mil. And then you're also going to have an additional stop. So it would be the equivalent of, you being at a 5.6 or definitely 5.6. So obviously, that if you shot something at f4 and then you went to 5.6, you're going to have a little bit more in focus. Now, with that being said, so that you understand the reason why that exists is because you have to move back to frame it the same. The things that have to be taken into account is number one, are you moving back to frame it the same? If you had a 40 mil on a full frame, you put that same 40 mil on a crop sensor, but you don't change your position, your out of focus area will be the same. If you take the image from the full frame camera and you then in post punch in to that image to frame it exactly the same as the image on your crop sensor camera, your out of focus area, your depth of field, your bokeh is going to look exactly the same. Because you have not increased the distance, you have not increased that depth of field, and it literally is no different than you taking the shot with your full frame and just cropping that frame, and then it's going to blow it up to the size that it is. There is no difference. So it will be exactly the same. So you really don't need to multiply your aperture by your crop factor because it's not relevant. It's not going to make a difference. Your stuff is going to look exactly the same. The second factor is that it really depends on how close your subject is to the background. If you don't have anything in the background to be able to show this additional depth of field, by all accords, the images are going to look relatively the same. Now, yes, and scientifically, you do have more depth of field, but if there's not something that's close enough to your subject to show that additional depth of field, it's not really going to make a difference. So I think that's why that is something that's not talked about as much, but it is something that does apply if you are backing yourself up and if you do have our background elements that are closer to your subject that may be a little bit more in focus, then you will definitely notice that difference. With all of that being said, it still goes back to the fact that the only reason this is a thing is because we're comparing one thing to another thing. And if we remove that comparison, none of this really matters at the end of the day. Again, it is something that makes sense to know. It makes sense to keep it in the back of your mind. It makes sense to understand how it applies to what it is you're doing, your photography style, or any particular given session that you're working on. But at the end of the day, we're simply comparing one thing to another. And if we remove that comparison, the only thing left is to just shoot, to get out there and shoot and just make great images and make great content. Now, before I end this video, there is one more thing that I want to touch on. And back when I first got into photography, I did not understand why this was a thing. And that is, why do we still have to apply the crop factor when we're using a crop sensor specific lens? I never understood that, because in my mind, I thought the whole point of getting a crop sensor lens was so that we didn't have to worry about the crop factor and that wouldn't be a thing. The reason why it is still a thing is because of the thing that I've said a few times in this video. It all has to do with comparing it back to the full frame. Now, a crop sensor lens is simply a lens that is designed smaller so that the image circle that that lens produces is only big enough to cover a crop sensor, an aps-c sensor size lens. Whereas a full frame lens has a image circle that's big enough to cover a full frame size sensor, which is obviously bigger than a crop sensor. So when you're putting the full frame lens onto a crop sensor camera, it's essentially only using a part of that image circle, and hence you have that punched in effect. And so an aps-c specific lens, a crop sensor specific lens, is simply a lens that is made smaller so that there isn't extra space in essence. And so therefore the lens can be made cheaper. A lot of times it's not as technical on the inside. But at the end of the day, the crop factor is based off of field of view. And the field of view is based off of the full frame standard. And that does not change simply because you're using an aps-c specific lens. We still are taking the image that we're getting, comparing it to a full frame, and hence we still have to apply that crop factor. So hopefully that answers that question, if that was ever a question you had. At the end of the day, now that you know, that's great, but just focus on getting out there, shooting, creating great content, and just enjoying the gear that you have, because that's all that really matters.